So we're gonna get into the concept of tall torso through the penultimate stride. This is one that kind of readily sees the post that I put up on Instagram, and I get a lot of questions about, what do you mean about keeping a tall torso? Won't keeping a tall torso prevent you from being able to generate power? And I wanna verify a few things. When I talk about tall torso through our penultimate stride, and specifically as we speak about 2-foot jumping, is the concept of kind of optimizing the plant sequence when we make our takeoff position, if that's a little bit more understandable for you. But for instance, me being a right-left plant, which means my last 2 steps are right-left, my penultimate stride is going to be that left to right push into my plant. So the penultimate stride will be here as I go into my plant. This stride, as I push forward into my takeoff, is my penultimate. And what I want to see with my athletes through the penultimate is their torso or their upper body to remain half decently vertical. Now, that don't mean that it has to be perfectly straight up and down. So if I'm going from the side and I'm in this kind of penultimate stride position, which is arms are back, you'll notice that I try to keep my shoulders relatively over my hip. And this accomplishes a couple things. One is it's going to ensure that we keep our center of mass behind our plant foot. When this makes contact with the ground, if we're really far forward, what's going to happen is that when this plant hits the ground, a lot of my mass is already loaded over top of it. So as soon as I bring my block foot through, I've blown through a lot of this plant. Means that I've blown through a lot of the potential of that leg to create power and lift. So let's go into that position again. If I'm in my penultimate stride, so I'm kind of stretched out here and I'm really far forward, I cycle through, I'm gonna have a little less time to be able to amortize power through that leg, versus if I have my penultimate stride extended here, my arms are back and I'm tall, when I transition through with my block foot, watch what happens here. And watch where the majority of my weight stays back from this side. You can see, I'm gonna do it from the other side as well, is as I step through with that tall torso, I'm gonna keep the mass majority of my weight loaded on the plant leg, and I'll also be in this nice stacked position, that heel, hip, and shoulder, or we call axially loaded, which means nice and straight up and down. It means that line of action is directly into the floor, and it's going to be thinking of a steeper takeoff angle. Not to mention, obviously, the last stride we want to make sure is nice and deliberate, but that's a whole other video. So the challenge I have for you is, as you're patterning your 2-foot jump and you're doing your second last big stride, that penultimate stride, which is this big stride here, is that you work on keeping the torso and your shoulders back a bit so we can really optimize and load up that plant leg. Okay, there's a handful of people, and now some of you are behind the computer screen going, but no, you need to get as low as possible to be able to jump as high as possible. And that'll work for a lot of people. But the trade-off we make in that scenario is, if we get really far forward and we're down here, every single split second of time it takes for us to unravel or extend that hip is extra time we spend on the ground, increasing ground contact time, and therefore bleeding additional potential energy. So we'd like to see, and if you take a look at the majority of the highest 2-foot jumpers in the world, they share that common trait, which is loading that plant and keeping the center of mass behind the plant, so that when we transition through, we're in a really, really, really advantageous position to be able to punch that block, which is that squeak you usually hear when a good jumper leaves the ground, and lift off on a very steep angle. Typically, the ones you see that flex a great deal in their takeoff are ones that are covering a little bit more horizontal distance. If you're familiar with the dunk world, a really good example of this would be Sir Isaac. He's a dunker from down south, very talented leaper, very heavy hip flexion, but he's very well known for covering a lot of distance on his jumps, and that hip flexion is going to help him cover that distance. If you're looking for peak maximal verticality, you're going to want to make sure you keep that center of mass loaded from behind your plant, so that when you transition through, you hit that stacked position early, and that stacked angle of action is vertical and not forward and on a little bit shallower angle. Okay, so again, a lot thrown at you there, but I think that's a pretty good representation of why keeping a taller torso through your penultimate stride will help you jump higher, and hopefully, if you're able to kind of get a handle on it in some of your efforts today, jump higher today.
it.